Subscribe to GSS for competition giveaways, free one-to-one lessons, and credits towards our vast catalogue of materials. Exercise targets. Vocabulary exercises. Pronunciation practice. Cadence rhythm.
The Invisible Man by H.G. Wells. Chapter 1. Interesting vocabulary. Cloth. Lay. Brightly. Stranger. Bandage. Unlike. Hand. Palmer.
Chapter 1. The Strange Man's Arrival.
The stranger came early one winter's day in February, through a biting wind and the last snowfall of the year. He walked over the hill from Bramblehurst Station and carried a little black bag in his thickly gloved hand. He was wrapped up from head to foot, and the edge of his soft grey hat hid every part of his face except the shiny point of his nose. The snow had piled itself against his shoulders and chest. He almost fell into the coach and horses more dead than alive, and threw his bag down. "A fire!" he cried, "in the name of human kindness." He stamped his feet, shook the snow from his coat, and followed Mrs. Hall, the innkeeper's wife, into her parlour. There he arranged to take a room in the inn and gave her £2. Mrs. Hall lit the fire and left him there while she went to prepare a meal with her own hands. To have a guest at Ipping in the winter was an unusually good piece of fortune, and she was determined to show that she deserved it. She put some meat on the fire to cook, told Milly, the servant, to get the room ready for the stranger. And carried the cloth, plates and glasses into the parlour and began laying the table. Although the fire was burning brightly, she was surprised to see her visitor still wearing his hat and coat, and stood with his back to her, looking out of the window at the falling snow in the yard. His gloved hands were held behind him, and he seemed to be thinking deeply. She noticed that some melted snow was falling onto the floor from his shoulders. "Can I take your hat and coat, sir?" she said. "And dry them in the kitchen?" "No," he said, without turning. She was not sure she had heard him, and was about to repeat the question. He turned his head and looked at her over his shoulder. "I'd rather—" "Keep them on," he said firmly, and she noticed the big blue gloves and bushy beard over his coat that almost hid his face. "Very well, sir," she said. "As you like. Very soon the room will be warmer." He made no answer, and turned his head away from her again, and Mrs. Hall, feeling her talk was unwelcome, finished laying the table quickly and— hurried out of the room. When she returned, he was still standing there like a man of stone, his collar turned up, the edge of his hat turned down, almost hiding his face and ears. She put down the eggs and meat noisily and called rather than said to him, "Your lunch is—" "Served, sir." "Thank you," he answered. He did not move until she was closing the door. Then he turned round and walked eagerly to the table. Mrs. Hall filled the butter dish in the kitchen and then took it back to the parlour. She knocked and then entered at once. As she did so, her visitor moved quickly, so that she only saw something white disappearing behind the table. He seemed to be picking something up. From the floor. She put down the butter dish on the table and noticed his hat and coat hanging over a chair in front of the fire. "I suppose I may have them to dry now," she said in a voice that could not be refused. "Leave the hat," said her visitor, and turning she saw he had raised his head and was looking at her. For a moment she stood looking at him, too surprised to speak. He held the napkin over the lower part of his face, so his mouth and jaw were completely hidden. However, it was not that which surprised Mrs. Hall. It was the fact that the top of his head above the blue glasses was covered by a white bandage, and that another covered his ears, leaving nothing of his face to be seen. except his pink pointed nose. It was bright pink and shining as it had been at first. He wore a dark brown jacket with a high black collar turned up. About his neck. His thick black hair struck out below and between the bandages. The bandaged head was so unlike what she had expected that for the moment she stood staring at it. He did not remove the napkin, but remained holding it, as she saw now, with a blue-gloved hand, and looking at her. From behind dark glasses, "Leave the hat," he said again, through the white cloth. She began to feel less afraid. She put the hat on. The chair again by the fire. "I didn't know, sir," she began. "That—" and then she stopped. "Thank you," he said shortly, looking from her to the door, and then met her again. "I'll have it nicely dried out, sir, at once," she said, and carried his coat out of the room. She looked at his bandaged head and dark glasses again as she was going out of the door, but he was still holding the napkin in front of his face.
End of Part 1. Interrogative practice. Basic question form. Present simple example. Auxiliary, do. Subject, your family. Verb, live. Complement, near here. Ask a direct question to Mrs. Hall, the innkeeper's wife. Exercise code is 0, 0, 0, 1. 0, 0, 0, 1. Send your answers to GSS_2024_66 or ask your teacher for options.